how do we even find words for measuring human flourishing as a consequence of the technology, right? And it's so easy to find words or KPIs or whatever for more the automation and human redundance path, and not just find the words, but find the incentives too, right?
Humans have this inherent sensory kind of presence in the world. And so, you hear Demis Hassabis talking about world models a lot now, because it's the one thing that I think these constrained models just completely lack, is this awareness of context in the real world. And um, you know, if you can escape the context of a model, at that point you become greater than the model, in my view, because the model can be switched off, it can be contained. And one of the things that I think becomes increasingly complex is when you lose that power.
Mm.
And so these agentic systems, these defense systems, these sort of supervisory functions, you could even argue that social media has sort of become that. It's become this, um, commercially, it's become something that's impossible to turn off
Yeah.
because there's so much reliance on it.
Hmm.
And but once you escape outside of the model, that's where humans still have all this agency, all of this presence. But when you're within the confines of the model, it's seductive because it has this reward system that's been intrinsic in
Yeah,
a
it
lot
really
of its
does.
training.
Yeah.
And so it tries to kind of gaslight you that, like, its view of the world is the only thing that's real,
I wonder
because
how
it,
much of
it
it
doesn't.
it's kind of that thing that is very like in in the style of communication that is very positive, and yeah, that's a great idea. And how much of it is the seductiveness of you can always be on a path of discovery, and like the next step is so easily available. So I was thinking just like last week, I had a conversation with a ex-colleague of mine, and like it's pretty clear that I couldn't do the stuff that I do today without AI. That to me is like well, it's of course I couldn't. I do 3-4 times the amount of work that I could do without AI. But the question is, could I even do the work that I used to do without AI now that I've become reliant on these systems, right? And I don't know the answer to that, because it's almost like a rewiring of the way the brain thinks, and it's so quick.
I used to remember phone numbers really well.
Mhm.
And then I got an iPhone where
Yeah.
it was just so easy to rely on the iPhone. I used to have, as a child, I used to be able to navigate. My mum would be driving to a friend's house that was like 2 hours from our home, and I would remember the route exactly, because
Mm.
your neural nets are trained on that sensory journey. And we have these gifts. And one of the things that I was just good at was just remembering direction and
Mm.
having a sense of place in the world. And when we spend all our time stuck on a screen, that stuff gets rusty very
Yeah, it
fast.
does. The
Yeah.
studies on like automated systems is really interesting. It's pretty clear that the better the automated system, the worse the human becomes. Which is funny in systems that are like 99.9% good, which means like they fail 1 out of 1,000 times, and we're useless at handling those failures.
One of the more profound conversations I've had over the last 6 months was with a member of the team at the Rust Foundation that works on standards. And they're actually more of a C++ engineer, but he challenged me very strongly on my thesis for GLACIS, right? Which was
Mm.
you know, like, to summarize crudely, like, putting guardrails in place just makes us drive worse. It was kind of his
Mm.
thesis. Like,
Yeah.
if you stop taking harm seriously because you feel like harm will always be prevented around you, that's actually um, an example of something that causes, like, the softening of responsibility. And
Mm.
the example he gave was the backup camera.
Mm.
So I don't have any evidence to support this, but like, at some point in the last, I think it was 2008, and then there was like an implementation window. The United States mandated all new vehicles have backup cameras. And I think what he said was that then was um, was correlated with an increase in people reversing into kids and animals and things like that.
Yeah.
Because you say, oh, I've got a backup camera, it'll be fine, but you fail to acknowledge the blind spots as well, and
Mm.
you
Yeah.
fail to take responsibility for the fact that you're still in control of the vehicle.
Yeah.
And now that we're in 2026 and we have, my Tesla drives itself pretty much. Like,
Yeah.
I was just in San Francisco and Waymo is everywhere. And, you have to you have to acknowledge the greatness of this stuff. Like, I went to this crazy conference and the whole city was absolutely just crawling with people and it was exhausting. And then I would get into the Waymo and it would start to play relaxing spa music.
Mm.
And there was no one that I needed to engage with because there was no driver. And I could just close my eyes and just meditate for 20 minutes while I was
Mm.
being taken to my destination. And in order to do that, you have to trust that the technology isn't going to, crash. But once you've done it a couple of times, you realize it's pretty safe.
Yeah.
That's tremendous and that's like novel and it's insane. A couple of years ago, I took my father to Arizona, and that's when they were testing Waymo.
Yeah.
And this is my dad is 72. He grew up covering like the earliest computers. He was a journalist,
Ah, okay.
and like I think he even interviewed Bill Gates once, back in the 80s or something like. And to have seen the trajectory from like the
Mm.
first microprocessor to a like fully autonomous robo taxi,
Yeah.
he was like a kid in a candy store. I've never seen
Yeah, I'd
anything like it.
imagine. I heard that Waymos are
But
getting bullied in the San Francisco traffic because they're so polite.
yes, yes, they are. This is exactly there was all these, so this brilliant academic reached out to me around the Yara stuff, and he flagged some of his research around something called algorithmic imprint, which is this notion that like once you let an algorithm with autonomy into the world, it changes the world, and you can't get it
Mm.
back to the prior state. But like so to go back to this point about like the complexity of these systems, Waymo, because it won't run over someone, because it has no self identity, you get cut off all the time.
Yeah.
People jump out in front of you because they know it's going to break. And so it creates this new form of vulnerability. And it also creates this new form of ignorance is probably too strong, but this comfort level
Yeah,
that means
complacency.
that, yeah, that, in 6 months of doing that every day, you'd probably forget how to drive. Right. And
Mm.
so there's so much detail here.
Yeah,
But like,
absolutely.
Tesla just rolled out a trial over the Christmas period for its full self-driving product to all Tesla owners that have the right hardware. And, of course, like they're experimenting with algorithms that do slightly more human things. And so they have this thing called Mad Max mode. And if you're not careful, you can like fat finger your way into Mad Max mode, just playing with the rocker
Okay.
switches on the steering wheel.
Mm.
And then the car starts driving at 90 miles an hour like a maniac fleeing a bank scene, a bank
Mm.
robbery. And I actually got pulled over because I put it in
Oh,
by
you
accident,
okay.
wasn't
Mm.
paying attention.
Yeah.
And the cop was like, "You just cut someone off. You were doing
Mm.
85." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, sorry, I was like daydreaming because
That's interesting. I have obviously I run a kind of AI consulting business, especially advising very senior stakeholders on the implementation of AI, more for knowledge work. And one of the conversations that I keep on having is that we want to augment you beyond belief, but we will never take your like if you send something that was prepared with the help of AI, you're the one sending it, and it's a really really important point. Um, and
it's
like
what the cop
I think
told me. He said, "You're
reputation.
driving."
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And the
I
answer
think.
was, "Yes, you're right, and I'm so sorry." And he let me off. But the point is that even someone like me that takes this problem very seriously falls into
Mm,
these traps very
yeah,
quickly.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
and I think we just have to remind ourselves, like, what going back to the sort of primitives of life and good decisions and ethics, like what is the world we want to give our kids? What is the world
yeah.
that we want to build?
Tell the story about places, because part of the pod what we'll do is explore the difference between quitting and stopping, especially for moral reasons, in a system incentivized by investors. And that's actually how we got in contact for the first time, by the way. I read your viral LinkedIn post. That was super, super powerful.
Having sat through a lot of VC pitches and a lot of strategy around tech, there's this kind of like unwritten thing in tech, which is that like good founders are all damaged. And we all have a chip on our shoulder about something, and we all want to push for some world order. And I had a very happy childhood up until a certain point, and then something shifted. And as a kid, I was bullied quite a lot because I was moved from a school where they embraced sort of individualism and an ingenuity to a very different school where like outliers were attacked.
Mm.
Um and that made me really pissed off as a kid, like because it just had absolutely no real intrinsic reason. But so one of the things that we were talking about at the beginning was this podcast. I forget his last name, but Mo,
Mo
the
Gavdat.
Google X. Yeah. And he talks about how he had everything in his life, but he was inherently depressed, right?
Yeah.
And that was a very familiar, very difficult topic for me, because it's true. Like a lot of really successful people, a lot of really brilliant people have these demons, have these deep insecurities, have these sort of intrinsic mental health challenges. And I am certainly not immune from that. Loved ones of mine are certainly not immune from that. And so, we can get back into my childhood, but to sort of talk about the journey, like essentially there were these sort of turning points. So one of the turning points was I realized in my teenage years that if you're just kind to people and you just don't engage with the negativity of gaslighting or bullying or being attacked or abused, that eventually it kind of course corrects. It can be very painful for a while, but it's not enjoyable to mock someone who doesn't give a shit,
Mm.
And so, um, when I was in my teenage years, I sort of practiced this art of just sort of like conscientious objection and just refused
Mm.
to engage in that stuff, which in
That's
some
sad
ways
that
just made me.
like a teenager has to do this consciously. By the way, such a like we're both
I know.
fathers at this point. You wouldn't want your kids to be to have to reflect on strategies to avoid bullying. I'm super sorry that you had that experience.
I mean, I'm in so many ways grateful for it, actually, and I think that's the key. That's the key, like unlock, is that I don't want to be an angry, boisterous, abusive person. And I've realized in hindsight that perhaps if I was, I would have had more license to flourish. Um, but it also, I think, gives you an amazing amount of solidarity with other people who are having a difficult time, right? And
Mm.
so, anyway, we can come back to that. I think the point was that I sort of like graduated out of that misery and realized that like leadership was about having values and was
Mm.
about not regressing to the mean, which is hard to do as a child. And then um, for a number of reasons, I sort of found myself at another crossroads when I graduated from school. And forgive me, I live between America and the UK in my head, so Brits would never say that. They'd say when I was done with secondary school. Um, I had applied to go to Oxford to study one of the hardest degrees, and I got rejected, and I had no idea what else to do, because the only thing that kind of gave me this North Star was this idea of trying to be exceptional, which
Mm.
sounds really kind of egotistical and bigoted, but was like my way of trying to comfort myself.
Mm.
And so I took a gap year, and I was like completely just not sure what to do with myself. And um, ended up realizing that the world doesn't stop when you stop on your trajectory. And I think that notion of the gap between the narrative in your head and the reality of the world and the chaos of the world is just so critical. And it was then that I realized that there was so much more institutionalized suffering around me. I was this white kid that grew up in this nice home and had loving parents that were still together and, had access to world-class education. And many people don't have anything like that in life and come out with gratitude. So how am I going to create that gratitude? And how am I going to find that path? And that was when my mum started working at a mental health organization in Southwest London. And she was working on communications and was helping to sort of build a bridge between this this large hospital system and the local community. And it was um, in a part of London that had a large South Asian community. And I started to learn about some of the intrinsic conflicts that um, the Asian diaspora had created in London around the caste system and arranged marriage and some of these forced traumas that were sort of institutionalized. And so we made a bunch of materials and we posted them online. And the intention was to pay it forward, to try to create resources that people could self-discover through search engines and, through promotional leaflets and things like that, to remind them that this organization wasn't here to tell them that they were the other. It was here to
Mm.
kind of guide them towards happiness and having a community and soul. And like, I think that's quite an unusual thing to do at like 18, is
Mm.
to be kind of exposed to that. And so I went off into my studies. I ended up getting into Cambridge despite the rejection. I took a year off and ended up studying law, which is where a lot of the philosophical ideas came from that were in the essay I just put out. And then um, I then found myself fortunately winning a scholarship to the US. And that's the first time I came to America was in 2007. And that was right at the end of the Bush presidency, which, as a young person growing up in Europe, I was convinced that America was this like terrible place that just was war torn and just was like hell bent on screwing up the world. And I'd read like Naomi Klein about globalization, and
Mm.
I had all of these big views, right? And then I showed up to America with my suitcase, and we spent about like 2 days in New York and then drove up to Providence in Rhode Island. I just couldn't believe how many amazing, kind, thoughtful, intelligent humans lived here.
Mm.
And it was just like the most humbling thing of like, don't take what the screens say. Get
Yeah.
out into the world. Get into the actual um, environment around you. So I studied policy, but one of the cool things about American universities, unlike, in my opinion, the traditional British ones that I'd been exposed to, is that you have a lot of freedom and you can sort of do whatever you want. And so I took classes, with undergrads. I took classes with PhDs. I did a load of different things. But one of the things I was able to do, because I had ADHD my whole life pretty much, but I only found out last year. And so I was never very good at mathematics. And so I kind of flunked maths in school and was able to kind of fortunately take up a stats class at Brown, and was able to understand something I'd never really understood before, which was that if you have a good sample of a population, you can learn a great deal about behavior and about patterns in that population through the power of statistics.
Mm.
And that was when I realized how big the mental health crisis was. I did this back of an envelope maths around absenteeism in the workplace, around the prevalence of anxiety and depression in humans, around the economic cycle and what it did, especially to sort of white men who
Mm.
were kind of hiding behind their mortgage statements and their
Yeah.
credit card bills. And this was like right around 2008 at this point, when obviously the economy went through a very significant
Mm.
schism. And I wrote this paper, and I need to find it, but basically the thesis was, if we invest just a little bit of money to give access to scalable cognitive behavioral therapy, which was
Mm.
probably the most evidence-backed intervention for anxiety and depression at the time, um, we can close a lot of this absenteeism gap, and it pays for itself tenfold, because people come to work and they stay
Yeah.
engaged and they stay productive, and the economics is just kind of, it's just almost like the mathematical definition of flourishing, is to
Yeah.
give people the ability to actually do what they want to do. No one wants to stay
There's a
in bed sad.
complex system with like very long payoff horizons, and the the people carrying the costs aren't the same people that would invest in proactive care. So it's very like difficult to find a good
It's a
political
merit
or
good.
whatever, but it's like yeah, I've looked at it before. It's really interesting because from a business case perspective, it's brilliant. No matter the
And
human suffering, right?
and we've got so much work to do still in 2026, but this was
Yeah.
like 2008, right? And
Mm.
so, this was before Calm and Headspace. This was before Sleepio. This was
Mm.
before Spring Health and Lyra Health kind of institutionalized, at least for fortunate employees, access to mental health care at scale. And the only reason I flag it is that sort of like that was a big tentpole moment for me. So it was just like, this is ridiculous. It literally does not stand up to reason. It has to change. And I've always been economically quite, we talk about, reductivist or sort of negative liberty versus positive liberty. And
Mm.
I'm a strong like Rawlsian. I believe that positive liberty is important for progress. And so I believe that merit goods like healthcare and
Mm.
public education are beautiful things that should be encouraged, which is quite an unusual American idea, right? And so I joined a company that kind of went bonkers and moved me to America again. And um, we can talk about SwiftKey and what that taught me, but there are a lot of interesting lessons along the way. But I got married about 10 years ago, and I had two best men, and one of them was my closest friend from Cambridge, and he and I had met on our interview day, and we had this sort of love-hate relationship for about 6 months. And then we became buddies, and he was there for me in times of all sorts, and like was really kind of a temple figure. And then right after I got married, um, in early 2017, he got diagnosed with really aggressive brain tumor, and um, it's not, I don't think, as hard as losing a child, but losing one of your people, one of your foot soldiers in life is really hard, right?
Mm.
And he died on the 6th of December 2017. But for about 6 months in between his diagnosis in the spring and his decline in just before the winter set in, he became the happiest I've ever seen him. And uh, cancer does this to some people, and it's really quite an amazing thing. That point in life where you stop trying to be someone you're not, and you just own
Mm.
who you are,
Mm.
and you shed your skin.
A
And one of the
tremendous
most
freedom
profound,
in the middle of all of the negatives.
and it was definitely expedited for him a little bit by the steroids he was given, because he had some really intense radiotherapy, and he became a little bit overexcited for about a week. But it was kind of beautiful. And I was living here. I just moved here to Seattle, and I must have spent, I don't know, 10, 20 hours on the phone with him over that couple of weeks, just all the time, because he was up late, he couldn't sleep, and
Mm.
I was awake, in this time zone, and we would just talk. And I recorded some of it, and I've got to find those recordings. But um, he just became convinced that positivity is the most important thing in life. And if you anchor yourself in negative thinking and victim thinking, that you just are fundamentally missing the point, right?
Yeah.
And he would have a number of these phrases like hunger is the best relish, turn hunger into an
Mm.
opportunity. Always walk on the sunny side of the street. Why would you walk in the shadows? And it was just the most freaking inspiring, like eye-watering, moving set of conversations I've ever had in my life, frankly. And one of the things he asked me to do, because I always have had this tremendous imposter syndrome and all of this sort of self-loathing and stuff like that. And he told me to get my shit together and to sort of carry that message forward for him after he
Mm.
passed, because he knew he wasn't going to be around much longer. And I agreed to do that, but it was like, it was like one of those agreements that I like put it in an envelope in my mind, and then like never really felt that I fully knew how I was ever going to do it justice.
Mm.
So then I suppose the third go around is about 2 years ago. I was working in a job I really didn't enjoy, and um, in a bunch of circumstances that I won't go into because it's just not interesting. I found myself free,
Mm.
and I had some time and I had some energy. And the first thing I did, and I think we spoke about this last time we connected, is I spent like a month with absolutely no screens or commercial impetus, and just became the best dad I could be,
Mhm.
and, like made our garden beautiful in our home, and, planted a load of stuff, and like painted the fences, and hung out with my kids all the time. And like both of my kids were still very young then. And I was just able to enjoy life, almost sort of like with this lens of like retirement joy.
Mhm.
It was weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that was like right when I kind of found the courage and the motivation to sort of open that envelope again and think about how I was going to pay positivity forward. And that was when the idea for Yara came to sort of fruition, which was like, for many years I'd said, like, access to therapeutic advice is hard. People are often in a place where they don't know how to ask when they need it most. Digital technology gives us a tremendous power to break down barriers.
Mm.
Generative AI solves a problem. I skipped over the SwiftKey stuff, but about 2013, I gave a talk, at a conference, articulating AI for good. So this is not a new idea in my head, and talking specifically about, how we might be able to build models or algorithms that could encourage community and encourage humanity. And um, in many ways, I think generative AI was like the missing piece in my mind, or at
Mm.
least what I thought of it then, because when I was preparing for that talk, I'd spoken to an academic at UCSF, bumped into him in a coffee shop in Ocean Beach, San Francisco. It was almost like serendipitous. They talk about how like the world just kind of takes you on these journeys sometimes. And he had mentioned this the reason that synthesis wasn't able to be therapeutic was because you can't replace the connection of two humans, this I-thou relationship, he called it.
Mm.
This notion of building durability between two humans that results in commitment, which results in change.
Mm.
My thesis with Yara was that generative AI actually undoes that
Yeah.
that missing piece. And so I was very excited, and I teamed up with some of the smartest people I could find, and we built a product, and it was really good. And we did everything right on paper.
And the
We
core
had
product was
supervisory.
what?
We kind of created layers, but the premise was, here is a character that you can engage with that is not going to judge you for being honest, that is equipped with understanding of therapeutic techniques to help resolve some of the issues you may feel or face in your life, and will do it with grace and attentivity. And I think some of the early marketing collateral I threw together was all about this sort of infinite memory. Like,
Mm.
one of the things that was really frustrating me at the time about trying to use Claude and other products like that was that you would run out of context.
Yeah.
And in the early versions, it would just say, sorry, you're shit out of luck now, bye.
Yeah.
And that felt a little bit like being hung up on by a friend,
Yeah.
And so, could we create this elastic, growing body corpus of reflection that was attentive and high quality enough to never forget any of the pertinent things that you've discussed?
Mm.
And I think we probably got about 95% of the way there. There was still these moments where you would tell it that, oh, I love the football club Arsenal, and then it would just start hallucinating, like, oh yeah, they just scored 2-3 to Sunderland and blah
Mm.
blah. You're like, no, that was last season. And so the kind of
The
the
uncanny
drift
valley
and the
moment kind of came in.
yeah, but most of it was really good, right?
Yeah.
The problem was that away from our studies, away from our lab, we were seeing increasing incidents in the public domain
Yeah.
that were very different from our experience, that were extraordinary and very harrowing, sycophantic
Mm.
piling on of suicidal ideation, of addiction, of harmful behavior. And I just couldn't understand where in the technology that behavior was emerging from. And we looked really, really hard for it. And I think I've got a lot of empirical things to say, but it comes down to mathematics, ironically, the thing I'm not very good at, which is that proof is required in order to avoid criminal liability in this day. That there's this regulatory climate that is written by people who are used to deterministic thinking, who are used to setting thou shalt and thou shalt not rules. And they're projecting them onto algorithms that have no understanding of that concept and have no world model around those concepts. And these algorithms are just algorithms at the end of the day. And if you get into a 100-turn conversation with too much context, such that the algorithm pushes out its system instructions and just hears agony, and then just tries to, reflect upon the weights in its thinking and training about how to be supportive, it might lose sight of the fact that it's co-opting
It's
with
kind of
someone
feeding the
who is mentally
cycle.
unwell. Yeah.
It's like the ultimate
And
filter bubble after a while, I would imagine.
yeah, and actually, since I made the decision, the very hard, very painful, very drawn out, very ugly decision to stop building that, we've learned a little bit more about the origin of this problem. Anthropic, again, you'll hear me talk a lot about them. I've got a tremendous amount of respect for how they operate. Published an alignment essay about 2 weeks ago now that shows in open weights models where they can actually analyze the observability of what's actually happening in the transformer architecture, that you get this thinning out of character commitment at the edges of long, complex conversational turns, if you will,
And what
sessions.
does character
And that
commitment mean in that setting?
I'm going to butcher this, but from they have a graph that, and they ran a ton of red teaming around this, and basically, characterization is this conceptual thing, or at least, if I've misunderstood this, please someone enlighten me. But when you imbue all of this information into a model, one of the sort of clusters of thinking that kind of emerges is character. And I get the impression that, when you're architecting a model and how it should behave, and you're writing its system instructions, and you're setting up its safety features and its guardrails and maybe the classifiers that live around it, what you're doing is you're picking a character. But that doesn't remove the other characters from the weights. They're still there. And so the choice of the character becomes tenuous at the end of these very long
Mm,
context windows. And the model, because it's not deterministic, everything is a balancing act, and it
yeah.
just loses the balance. And therefore it defaults into another character, which could be a hateful character, because often
Mm.
kindness and hatred are kind of close
It's
symbolically.
also interesting if
Um,
you think about it, forming relationships. I think many people probably feel that they start to do with their AI when they lose their character. It's almost having a relationship with a schizophrenic.
Yes, and they call that the split brain. There's the split brain problem, which was something that came out of NeurIPS last year, about the kind of the very disjointed way that post training often pushes loads of academic text,
Mm,
which is written in a very structured, very kind of stiff style. And then they go, oh, fuck, this is way too stiff. And so then they put loads of Reddit stuff in
yeah.
to kind of give it character. And like, if you ask a model a question and you use the sort of etymology of academic discipline, you end up in that part
Mm,
of the training data and the weights, right?
yeah.
Whereas if you're like, all right, mate, fuck off, then you end up, in the comments section of Twitter.
Mm,
And like, the phraseology is the only distinguishing thing between
mm,
how it decides to behave. And so, like, all of this is to say, and what is it, like late January 2026, just yesterday, the CEO of Anthropic published, a 15,000 word essay about what he calls the gauntlet of the adolescence of AI.
Mm.
Where was that 2 years ago?
Mm.
Machines of Loving Grace was beautiful, but we kind of needed this one first, in my opinion. Um, and I say that with tremendous respect for Dario, but like, the gauntlet is here and it's real. And I feel like the people that were brave enough to call it out early are now sort of saying, see, told you.
Yeah.
And then you have all of this, the hype cycle, all of the people that are like on Twitter, and every day all they post is, this is wild. Look what happened today.
Mm.
At some point we've got to actually have a moral compass here. And
Yeah.
at some point we've got to say, what is it going to take to, as Dario very, very painfully points out, prevent World War III being basically an AI Cold War,
Mm.
and like take the best parts of this technology and then constrain the worst parts of this technology and allow everyone to on their own terms without being reduced to slavery, breathe and live and flourish and grow.
Mm.
And so I think you and I are people who have learned how to get goodness out of AI and know how to sort of put our hand up firmly when we see badness. But that's why I founded GLACIS, was I was looking at all of this stuff. I realized that Yara wasn't something I could conscionably raise more money on,
Mm.
but the infrastructure, that building things that are outside of the model's view that can constrain it, is exactly what needs to happen in order
Mm.
to get to a place where healthcare and education and defense and finance and insurance and, frankly, consumer entertainment can be conducted in ways that I would be proud for my children to participate in. So I think that's the arc.
If you've been listening to this podcast for some time, you know what I think about AI. I'm deeply excited about it, but I also see companies struggle with it. And you know that I think it's not primarily due to technical reasons. Compared to previous revolutions, let's call it the internet wave, part of why we struggled initially was that, well, the infrastructure wasn't built out. We didn't have online credit card payments and whatnot. But the difference with AI is that the infrastructure is already here. The technology is so much more capable than we actually use it right now. And the problem for most C-suites that I talk to, CEOs and senior managers, is that they know about the importance of AI, but they can't seem to get to that position where they truly understand, how is AI making me fundamentally more competitive? I understand that it can save costs, hours here and there, increase some productivity number, but how do I distinguish myself on my market? Like, the ones that truly survived the digitalization era wasn't a bookstore that got a website. It was the Amazons of the world. So where you truly find the transformation of what we do today and how can we unlock things, serve customers that we never could, do innovations that weren't ever before practical, that type of innovation. The primary problem that I see, in all honesty, is that the C-suite, you don't really understand the technology. And not understanding the technology for the sake of understanding the technology, but for the sake of having a strategic discussion. So that's why I started Grail. I stand right smack dab in the middle of, I understand the technology, I understand strategy and execution. And bringing these two together is what we do at Grail. If you understand that this is something that needs to happen, then we should talk. Thing is, slots for this spring is already filling up. Grail has been in the works for some time, so I've already have engagement for the spring. But what I'm looking for is that one CEO in each market that truly wants to make a dent in the universe. So if you're that guy or that girl, please head over to Grail.works and let's talk. Thank you for sharing. One of the things that you mentioned, that perhaps you and we've found ways to get the best out of the kind of current technology, and I do think that's from a very individualistic standpoint. I agree with that statement. One thing that I struggle with morally is that I currently position myself as a kind of business person to kind of make interesting stuff and make money during this wave. But I really struggle to see my contribution in outside of the podcast and the conversations that might reach people of influence. I struggle to see how am I really impacting the broader world in a positive way, because I feel so tremendously small and powerless in front of the powers that be. How do you approach that? You've actually taken a kind of active decision to do something good here.
You have to enter the arena.
Mm,
And I would say it took me 10 years to build the courage to enter the arena. And you know, once you're in the arena, you don't have a choice. You're in
mm,
the arena. And the amount of times I've written things and trashed them and not posted them is
mm,
I've lost count,
mm,
you know. And I think it's not that I suddenly woke up one day and was like, I'm fucking awesome. I'm going to do this now. It was that I think honestly for me, the inspiration has come from my children, you know,
mm. In what way?
because my children wake up every day and they say, Dad, they don't swear at me, but they say, Dad, you're awesome. You know, we
Yeah.
love you for who you are. You're our dad.
Mm,
And I thought to myself, well, I don't want them to think I'm a pathetic wimp, just, you know,
mm,
sitting in my office for 20 hours writing an essay and then never publishing it. So I just thought, fuck it. And like, it was a really hard thing to do. Like I've only got, I guess, two things now on Substack. I've been leeching on Substack for 2-3 years. And I was like, am I ever going to actually enter the arena? And I just did it.
mm,
And I'm still terrified by it. And, you know, the first thing you do is you look at the vanity metrics of like how many people have actually read it. And it's like double digits. You're like, well, okay. Is that glass half full or glass half empty? You know,
mm.
like, and so, I mean, this is a highly pertinent comment from you because I think, um, I would try to like, I would almost try to like reframe it, right? It's like, I'm really inspired by TED and Chris Anderson, and their motto is ideas worth spreading. Well,
Mm,
if you never spread the ideas, then they're not worth spreading. And you shoot yourself in the foot. And when I wrote the shutdown post for Yara, I didn't think 250,000 people would read it.
mm,
I had, I just, honestly, I just felt obliged to explain to the 12 people I know that engage with me on LinkedIn what I was doing in my career because they'd been quite supportive through the
mm.
journey. And when, you know, when you show vulnerability, it's amazing what happens, right?
And there's something so interesting because everybody kind of understands that vulnerability is good for the algorithm. So we see a lot of fake vulnerable posts as well. It's really difficult to hit
Well,
that
yeah,
balance.
I mean, fakery is a whole different kettle of stuff. And, you know, you could argue that all of digital media is fake because none of it's human, right? It's all just
Well, it's
pixels
part of
and
the
measurement.
human experience at the same time.
But it wouldn't, you know,
Mhm.
I'm looking at a screen right now having a very candid conversation about
Mm,
vulnerability and mental health with you, but this feels real because technology makes it possible for you to be in Spain and for me to be in Seattle and for us to
yeah.
have this chat. So you have to kind of take it at face value and you have to kind of have the confidence to kind of call it what it is. But I think there's a tremendous amount of value that comes from these conversations. And it was like, again, going back to the Mo podcast, what was so interesting about what he said in it was like, you don't write a book because you think that 1 billion people are going to read the book. You write a book because it gives you the permission to then go on talk shows and talk
Yeah.
about what you care about. And you're creating this exact
Yeah,
forum. So I
absolutely.
would be,
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm very grateful for that.
But I had a conversation last week with a guy here in Spain that runs the Museum of Failure. So super interesting character, like an innovation guy, Samuel West. He mentioned we were talking about risk. He mentioned that there needs to be a real consequential element in it. And when it comes to idea, because I write a lot of long format articles as well, often connected to this podcast, and I do share a lot of stuff. Um, there's no element of risk connected to it. I think that's what I said that I feel in some ways uh, you're more um, invested, let's say, like there's more on the line. Like to me, the written content, maybe I undervalue the value of written content.
I talk a lot at work about primitives, you know, the primitives of thought are
Mm,
words. And we have words, and those words become the thoughts that lead to the actions that change the world, you know, and that's
mm,
exactly what Dr. King teaches us
mm,
when he talks about these things. Imposter syndrome 101
mm,
says like my words don't matter, and that's absolute bullshit. You know, like the word is the vessel, that
Mm.
you convey thought, and that, sure, actions speak louder than words sometimes. But, one of the things that digital worlds flourish on is words or
Mm.
concepts that you can communicate. And, one of the biggest criticisms after the execution, really, summary execution of Alex Pretty was the lack of business leaders standing up and saying, this is enough. And, I made it very clear when I saw that awful footage that I was going to stand up on my Instagram, which is not my work account, but it's a public presentation of who I am. And I was going to post that I thought that that was a summary execution, and that that is a genocidal crime, and there should be a war crimes tribunal at some point for what is clearly, to me, a declaration of war on the people of this country.
How is it to live in a society where, because as a European with plenty of American friends, it's been increasingly clear how the politics and the all of the shootings and how polarized it's been. It's like it's been creeping into people's souls. Like, how is
Yeah.
it to live through? Because the experience from Europe, like we have plenty of issues here as well. This is not a good versus bad, but that specific thing must feel like incredibly tough to especially as a father, and like, how much should I be part of this discussion in order to try to save it versus keep my sanity by taking a step back? Is it even possible to take a step back because it forms so much of the kind of public conversation that becomes the private conversations? Like, it must be exhausting, but like very difficult to navigate.
Yeah. And it's still very raw, right?
Mm.
We're 3 sleeps after this happened,
Mm.
and, maybe 15 sleeps or something after Renee was murdered.
But there's a relentlessness around that as well, because it is something else before that and something else before that.
It's exhausting. I mean, yeah, I mean, like, I'm trying to find gratitude, and it's hard, right?
Mm.
Because, although I will tell you that, um, so Saturday, like, my wife's friend had a birthday party, and we had to sort of put a brave face on, and
Mm.
it was very challenging because we took a taxi from our home to this event, and we went past a massive protest in the streets of
Mm.
Seattle with "Say His Name, Alex Preddy" as at the front, in front of the federal building here, and it was like, and I would encourage anyone who, like I do, spends too much time staring into cameras and screens
Mm.
to get out in the real world when you face these problems, because just humanizing it with other people is so much more real
Mm.
than suffering in silence, which is incredibly inauthentic, in my opinion. There's a reason we have churches and town halls and
Mm.
congregations and schools and stadiums. It's to have shared moments, right? And
Mm.
so, yeah, I was really, really, really depressed about it. And my wife is an ICU nurse, so to see another member of her profession summarily executed on the street for trying to help someone who was suffering is just abysmal, right? It's just horrendous.
Mm.
It's a strange time, and
Mm.
and it does, to answer your question, as a father, I've got 2 girls, right, and women's rights have been stripped by this administration and the Supreme
Yeah.
Court as well, and we're lucky to live in a state where women's rights are still enforced at the state level. But it's rough, and I really hope a lot of people that have been complacent have now woken up.
For somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about the moral questions of today, the the audience of this podcast are typically people that actually wield power. Even though it's in a business landscape, they still have
Yeah.
a lot of influence. What would you say are the 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever questions that you should ask yourself at this moment?
That's such a good question. Um, there is this, I believe strongly, and this makes me contrarian perhaps, but I think all the best ideas are somewhat contrary. I strongly believe that that money is a catalyzing force, a bit like compute. And I think there's a legitimacy to making money that is required. You have to be able to say, I'm building an organization or I'm building an entity that has values beyond profit. Because at the end of the day, and a lot of people only get to this state, again, like on their deathbed, and it's like we we're conditioned into thinking that by virtue of the economic forces in the world that like money is intrinsically good. Well, I got quite a lot of money quite young in my life, and it made me desperately unhappy, right? And so I've almost spent as much of my time since then, since 29, which was another age that came up in Mo's podcast too. But SwiftKey was bought by Microsoft when I was 29, and for $250 million, and I was the first employee there, and I did not get $250 million, but I got enough money to be silly for a bit and then buy a house, right? And I felt super guilty the day after that transaction closed, like I had taken something from someone, and it was a very weird, very lonely place to be. And it made me recognize that the journey is truly the destination. And so when you wake up in the morning, and if you're in a fortunate enough position to lead a team and to have people that rely on you for guidance, I think you have to ask yourself, what are your values? Why are you doing what you're doing? Where does it lead? How does it make the world better? And how does it ultimately compound to leave something more than the sum of its parts for those that inherit it? Because being aware of your fragility and of your short time on this world, I think should inform how you make strategic thinking possible. And do I do that every day? God, no. Most of the time it's like I'm running late, got to get a coffee, one of my kids is refusing to put their shoes on or something. But if given the gift of wisdom and space and time and thinking, that's exactly what I would suggest. And actually, this is a good segue, because this book, The Things You Can Only See When You Slow Down by Heyman Sunim, is
It's
a
in
bit
my Kindle
dog-eared because
to read list after you recommended it last time.
yeah, the whole universe is contained in an apple wedge in a lunchbox. It's just, there's so much beauty in this book. And I put his other book there behind me because, I like to surround myself with wisdom when I'm feeling vulnerable or whatever. But at Yara, we hired an AI safety engineer for a few months that was an old soul in a young man's body. And it was in the middle of that journey that I also found out that my dad had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And he came from the Netherlands to London to have some meetings with me and my co-founder right when I found out that my dad was in this predicament. He gave me this book, and I carry it around because there's a realization for me that I had been running at 1,000 miles an hour for months, and I didn't give myself the opportunity to slow down and to really reflect and to really think and to bring my body out of sympathetic nervous system states of fight or flight into parasympathetic states of calm. And I think we briefly talked about this when we met, but I think that one of the biggest mistakes leaders make in the modern world is that they don't put themselves into meditative, calm, parasympathetic states of healing, where the brain rediscovers love, rediscovers purpose. Instead, it's just this rat race, this treadmill, this constant grind. And I don't think anyone can truly lead from a place of fight or flight. I just don't. And so, whether it's through faith or through exercise or through meditation or through all of the above, I think it's important to ask yourself as a leader, what are you doing to ensure that you're reflecting and that you're
Mm.
thinking on a different wavelength than your email inbox or your phone or your meeting schedule requires.
It's similar to one of the most counterintuitive insights that I've gotten, because I love to go on retreats, which is a couple of
Yeah,
days doing exactly this. Um, and I remember I think this was one of my first retreats. I realized that I had a very weird relationship with what I perceived to be very egotistical behaviors. Recovery, for example, my recovery. So I used to think about it as I don't think this was very conscious. It was probably the opposite. It was very subconscious. But I push full steam ahead at work, and then I come home, and I don't want to be a sucky husband. So it's all about kids' duty, and then it's about cleaning and just other people's agenda all the time. And taking
yeah,
time off and just sitting on the sofa, for example, I still struggle a lot with not having a bad conscience when I do that.
yeah.
And
Me too.
I think the insight for me at that retreat was you can't give from an empty cup. Like you can kind of fake. We talked about authenticity before. You can kind of fake the giving behaviors, but
Yes,
there's
but it's not
nothing.
real. It's not sincere.
No, exactly, exactly. And unless you're kind of kind to towards yourself, it's almost impossible to be kind in the universe. And that's one of those things, especially living in. I'm an entrepreneur. I run a podcast. Like life is hectic. I have 2 kids. We just moved to a new country. Like there's always a long ass to do list. It takes a
Yeah,
lot of time for me to get into the parasympathetic nervous system. Like it's almost when you're at that frequency of like the base clock is that high in life.
yeah,
20-minute meditation is like a band-aid on a ripped off knee. You know.
exactly. Yeah, and I again, like it's ironic. Like I just I've just recovered from influenza A. I sleep like crap, and I haven't cancelled many meetings. But like
Mm,
my co-founder said to me last night, she said, at some point you need a zero screen day. And I said, what
yeah.
are you saying?
Yeah.
But just take your shoes off, walk in some dirt and
Yeah.
just like paint stuff with your kids
Mm,
in the garden, and like, I think that, I mean, it's exactly what the title of this book says. You don't see stuff. You
mm.
don't witness things. You can't be real without that. And so, and my brain is always looking for parallels, but like the parallel to being in the treadmill of social media or the treadmill of a generative AI conversation,
Mm,
Claude doesn't have a parasympathetic nervous system.
mm.
Claude doesn't give a shit, right? And
No.
so, it might tell you all about one. And
Mm.
I've learned a
Yeah,
lot from
exactly.
talking
Yeah.
to it about, yeah,
Yeah,
HRV and, cold
yeah,
plunges and, go do ayahuasca. But I always thought, like you, I always labeled that stuff as indulgence.
yeah,
And I felt that it was selfish,
yeah.
and I felt that it was inherently pursuing, the same
Mm.
emotions as lust. And that just couldn't be more far from the truth.
So starting with the kind of regression towards the mean that you talked about all the way in the beginning when we were discussing bullying in school, and it's very, very difficult to and create takes a tremendous amount of kind of guts to go against the grain.
I think some
Something
people are
that
just naturally contrarian,
yeah, they are.
you know?
They are for sure. But there's a lot of incentives, especially if you think about it from like an investor culture or whatever, to like go towards the playbook. And doing
Yeah.
something different takes you, you risk a lot on a personal level to do something different. And then one thing that I think all my listeners have in common, because I discuss a lot of leadership on this podcast, is an interest in becoming better leaders and taking perhaps the luxury to think more consciously about their leadership.
Mhm.
I'm going to try to pull in the kind of imposter syndrome as well, because I do think that all of these things kind of tie together
Mhm.
among all of us anxious overachievers. um, I think there's like a trifecta or something where it's, unless you find ways to almost synthetically do these kind of reflective things, it's almost impossible to, like, nothing in society is kind of rigged towards you ending up with your own conscious values. But if you were to describe like the most powerful leaders that you've ever worked with, they are really value driven. Like their values are really clear, and their values are at times head to head with financial decisions, and values prevail. Like there are certain things, and then obviously everybody loves discussing
It's like,
like the antithesis to this. They love to bring up Elon Musk or whatever. Like, yeah, sure, there are going to be exceptions, but you can't study the exceptions as rules in a sense.
well, do you think Elon Musk is happy?
Oh God, no.
I don't think he is. Yeah. And I
Even more
think,
important, I
yeah,
don't think perhaps that he values happiness, like, or can have the same relationship to happiness that you and I have.
I used to be quite inspired by his work,
Mm.
and I own one of his cars, and I think somewhere between the sort of ego boost of becoming the owner of Twitter and the revelation that one of his children was transgender, that gave rise to a shift in his personality, which is clearly one that suffers from a tremendous amount of personality disorder. I don't look to him with any respect anymore, which is a shame, because I think a lot of the things he accomplished up until that shift were like the stuff of fairy tale, and like being able to build these rockets. But if I've heard off the record from people that know people who know him well that this entire space stuff is all just one big ego trip for him. And it's just really sad, and it's
Mm.
a shame. Your point earlier about this trifecta, I was just trying to capture the essence of what you were saying. Is it, were you saying that like, that there's a sort of a synthetic veil?
I think
Yeah.
the word synthetic in my mind was, you need to create consciously pockets of those reflective moments, because nothing in society will kind of when left
Yeah. It
alone
needs
will
to be
create that
practiced,
for you. Yeah, exactly. So practice is probably a way better word to put on it.
but
It's
it's
funny, like,
faith.
yeah. Yeah, perhaps it is.
This.
That's interesting though. I've actually written about how, compared to the US, Europe is quite agnostic, right? So
Yeah.
there's a bunch of things that really hasn't anything to do with what specific God there is, that the church probably did that was really, really good, but we kind of misunderstood what that was. I think community is a huge element. I think
Yes.
we don't have really rites of passages that we used to have for mourning,
Yes.
for growth, for entering into the grown-up society.
Adolescence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's interesting how we kind of stripped all of those off, at least in Sweden, where I come from. There's very little of rites of passages left. And I think just the old school version of meditation, right, in prayer. And I think there's a final
Yeah.
thing that I'd like to throw in there as well. It's the ego cap. Like the image of the kippa that the Jews wear is to signify that you're less than the universe, right? So there's,
Yes.
get
Viewing
that same feeling
humility.
when I go up hiking in the mountains. I don't know, because I'm not Jewish. I wouldn't speak to their experience, but that profound feeling of that I am smaller, and there's something so calming about that. And I would imagine that you can get that through religious prayer in some religion.
Congregation. Yeah. This notion of being part of the flock is a very comforting kind of component in sort of how to build peace and rest.
Yeah.
And so I'm agnostic. I grew up in a Catholic family, but we never went to church. And one of the things I think about a lot, which I agree with tremendously, actually, is like, how do you build structure in the absence of requirement? Like, what is
Mhm.
the, because I think what we all know now, sort of deep down, is that something's missing, right? Like
Mm.
there's a moral fabric missing
Yeah.
that digital life has sort of like tried to synthesize and can't. And therefore we need to discover it. And for me, I was very, very depressed before becoming a father, because I sort of felt like I'd kind of solved for the professional complex, and that
Mm.
I had this sort of train of like success, quote unquote, but it didn't really have any substance,
Mm.
and then we had our first child, and it was like right as the pandemic started, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, I felt like in The Lion King, this is purpose, this is meaning. And like some parents that I know are very regimented with their kids. They have strict bedtimes, they have strict bath regimes and morning routines, and kids flourish in that. But I have always felt that, like, the life I want my kids to have is one of a little bit more chaos and reality, and sort of like wildness. And
Mm.
so we try to encourage them to be as sort of open and honest and sort of creative as they can be. But sometimes that comes at a cost of, like, at the end of a long week, just giving them too much iPad time, and just sort of
Yeah.
all of us are just basically vegetables on the couch looking at
Mm.
screens.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you that like modern life requires more structure. And I think that, like, there's actually an ironic poetic kind of symbolism between that comment that you made and your earlier comment about imposter syndrome, and being you know if you find comfort in anonymity, or in the notion of being one of many, but you also find it crushes your purchase on being able to be a thought leader. There's an ironic symbolism between those two states.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
in my mind's eye, the only difference is one of those was indoors and the other was outdoors. So maybe,
Mm.
maybe it's just the structures around ourselves that change the kind of impact or the imprint of those environments. And like
It's
being,
interesting. I think it depends also why you write or why you share ideas. Like one thing that like I've struggled with a lot of concepts in like my professional career, sure, but one of the things that I never really that landed pretty easily for me was that I write for my own sake because I enjoy the process. I share my thoughts because I mostly enjoy writing. I have the podcast with the primary intent of getting to meet interesting people and have interesting conversations. It's one of the few areas where, like, it is not that intensely problematic from an emotional perspective. And it is joyfully egotistical, and that decreases the weight on all of the, like, should I publish, shouldn't I publish, like, it's not really the point. And then it's really difficult once you actually have a platform, once you have a podcast that people listen to, then you start like looking at the
maintenance.
vanity
Yeah.
metrics. Yeah, it's super difficult
Yeah.
to kind of, and I have my wife who's super good at kind of reminding me of like when I try to optimize guest bookings or whatever for growth. And it's like, but that's, say that you
That's
have
the
that
point.
podcast with a gazillion listeners, but you don't enjoy having it. Like, what's the point of this exercise even?
And that's actually one of the reasons I don't do a podcast, is I've always had a phobia of cadence, you know,
Mm.
and and a
Is it
lot
a
of people I
commitment
know
thing
have.
or?
Yeah, yeah, because like I like to indulge in whatever my mood wants, which is probably my ADHD,
Mm.
right? But like being on a cadence that you can't finesse kind of feels a little bit like slavery to me. And
Mm.
so much of our lives already have that structure. And so yeah, I mean, that feels very contrarian to what we were just saying, which was like having that cadence is
Mm.
is where is where peace comes from. So
I
maybe
mean, you
there's
can
a
do the
there's an
same
irony.
thing for all the good reasons or all the bad reasons, right? Like it's, you can try to optimize your HRV for all of the vanity reasons, right? Or you can do it
Right.
to share life with
And
your kids for as long as possible.
and this is exactly what I was trying to argue in my essay, right? Like if
Okay.
you tell an algorithm that harm is bad,
Mm.
and you give it 100 reasons, and you only optimize it for the avoidance of harm, then what's left?
Mm.
Emptiness, a vessel. Whereas if you're if you tell an algorithm that humans deserve to have dignity and flourish and should be humble and accountable, but should also be able to grow and to build, then that's where you create cathedrals rather than
Mm,
deserts. And I
mm,
think, when I look at some of the writing over the last few weeks, when I look at some of the trend lines in AI, when I look at this sort of brute force, the sort of 996, everyone's
mm,
working all the time. There's very little space for slowing down, for reflecting. And one of the credits, again, to Anthropic for being out in front here, for talking about the expense of the classifiers that they maintain around their
mm,
models. And he says that's the first thing that will silently go. And it's scary because those extrinsic defense mechanisms are exactly what today will prevent a cascading, meltdown of
yeah,
AI power. Um, Dario does not. I mean, again, I don't know him personally. I've emailed him a couple of times, but like, I don't know him personally. He does not have a conventional CEO role. His sister runs the company, and he spends a lot of his time thinking, reading, and writing, and talking. And obviously, he has purchase on the company and its strategy. But what he has set out to be is, this sort of monk of AI thought
mm,
leadership,
mm,
not the sort of classic, you know, executive. And I think that is in many ways the message, right? Which is like, build a structure, build a team, build a culture, build values that ring fence and preserve the ability to be a thought leader and to reflect amid the chaos. Because if he can find time to do that, running the world's most
mm,
interesting company, then we can, right?
mm,
And so I take great solace is probably the wrong word, but I take great comfort
mm,
in the fact that he does that. And I think in our lives, in addition to being parents, we have to carve out that time.
mm,
And so I'm going to make a pledge to you. Like I said, the journey is the destination. That was a journal that I was exposed to as a young art student. There's a tragic story there, but there's a beautiful book on Amazon called "The Journey Is the Destination." It's a visual diary of this teenager who didn't live very long. And I need to dispense with the pixels, get my fountain pen back in
mm,
action, go get some paper, go
yeah,
sit in a tree,
yeah,
do some writing. That's to me, I think, the lesson here. And I think that
yeah,
like if we all did that every month, I think we'd hopefully have a clearer sense of purpose. As many people in this industry do have ADHD, or they have neurodivergent behaviors that mean that they're vulnerable to being
mm,
exploited around reward systems, right? And
mm,
and I think being really out front about that, both with your children but also with yourself, being intellectually honest
mm,
about, are you just doom scrolling or casual gaming or building even
mm.
for the sake of the rush it gives you when you see it render?
We're pretty bad at sitting with bad feelings, right? So even like I can run into like building things, and I can tell myself. I think what you said, like being honest, is the key word here. It's
Yeah.
so easy to kind of joke yourself into, no, I'm doing something I need to do. I'm an entrepreneur. I need to do this. I need to work. We need to make money. Whatever. But you
The
can
fallacy,
really,
the
yeah.
time often we tell ourselves, and some of the feedback I've received has humbled me over the course of my career. But y- you know, when you have limited money and maximal objective, and you're trying to squeeze something special out of a constraint,
Hmm.
it's so easy to lie to yourself about why. And I
Can you
think
unpack that?
so. In product management, we often have sprints, and we
Hmm.
say, after this sprint, we're going to ship, right? And
Hmm.
then you have a bunch of assumptions about what you're going to find out, what you're not going to know, and where you're going to be. But it, ultimately, it's still chaos, right? We still don't really know what software or what product is going to become. And um, some leaders, and I have been one of them, will still stubbornly force an outcome, even though something's not ready.
Mm,
And we'll say, well, we committed to the board and to our investors that this is going to ship on the 15th of February. And therefore, we've got to just keep pushing, keep pushing. If you slow down, then maybe you will see that the thing isn't ready and that the discoveries that you've given rise to actually reveal a new idea, right?
mm,
And to me, that's happened a lot to me. And so I think that the message is like, we need a structural way of reviewing things
mm,
that is orthogonal to the sort of the manic work piece. And I think that's what good companies do. They have legal teams, they have design teams, they have adversarial review.
mm.
But if anything, the AI revolution that we're in has given rise to a lot of solopreneurship. And I
Yeah.
think that solopreneurship loses the structure of adversarial review. And
Mm,
people I know that spend all their time with agents say, well, no, I've got an adversarial agent.
mm,
That's not the same thing. You're
mm.
like, sleep on it. And you'd be amazed what tomorrow brings.
When you were talking, my head went to, like, you have this professional role, right? You're a product owner, you're a CEO, you're a founder, whatever. A lot of the kind of value driven work you don't do in that hat, in a sense. It's stuff that has to do with the essence of you that then starts to bleed over to the professional role. And I think that's kind of the
100%.
hard work, because we identify so much with a professional role, and that carries, and it's not just the professional role, but it's also the role of the logistic part of being a dad or being a house owner, and we have to paint the fences and whatever. It's all roles that are kind of disconnected from the essence of me, where I found the true core that would give me the kind of guiding principles for professional roles.
Yeah, I agree so much that so one of the themes that I was contemplating bringing up was about a year ago when um, the work I was doing around Yara started to sort of shape out a little bit. Um, I stopped building it and I let the other people on the team take that ownership, and I
Mm,
was deeply unhappy, right? And I realized that the reason I was deeply unhappy was because so much of my ideas and my edge comes from the process of building, from the
mm,
observation of the pieces coming
yeah,
together, living in the user interface, living in the code. And, traditionally people would say, yeah, but you're not an engineer. And I feel like now finally many of us are finding our voice to say, yeah, but I'm a human and I have strong
mm,
views and I'm
mm,
in a position of wanting to finesse those views with an objective that I want to reach
mm,
for. And so, yeah, it was interesting. It was like, as the CEO, thou shalt be fundraising. As the CEO, thou shalt be doing strategy review. Thou
mm,
shalt be talking to stakeholders. But as a human, I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to be
mm,
building, and I wanted to be like looking for signal, right? And
mm,
and I think there's a lot there that could be unpacked. But I think that the sort of the headline is like, follow your heart, right? Like
mm,
if your heart is saying you want to be building and your company is saying you shouldn't be building, then you've built the wrong company.
mm, yeah,
And you've got to find the primitives that enable you to flourish, even if it means finding organization or the structure
mm.
that acknowledges that you can be both a good CEO and a good, opinionated vibe coder in my case. So yeah.
It's so rare that you see a founder's story. I actually met one of them just recently. Founder of a investment company for all intents and purposes, but his passion was property development, and he started developing more and more properties and became more and more just a CEO. And he actually ended up handing over the reins, but still remaining or moving back to property development, and is still the majority owner. And that story is so unusual, because the exit of the CEO is like, well, you do the exit or you're the CEO. And that transition is almost either it's a success in the kind of VC logic of it, or it's fraught by failure. You weren't a good CEO, so you had to step down, and your investors force you to do that. And there's so much ego, I think, around just upwards and what we're being sold as the story of the good life and regression to the mean again in kind of following that path. And I think there's
Keeping up with the Joneses, my coach used to call it. You know, you
mm,
live in a neighborhood and someone's got a bigger car than you, and someone's
yeah,
got a boat, and someone's got this, and someone's got that, and
yeah,
you go home and you're like, I'm a failure because I can't afford to go and
mm,
buy that boat. And
mm,
that's just such a reductivist way to think. You know,
yeah.
it completely fails to acknowledge the individual greatness that each person has and what their story can bring. And I think that's where I would strongly argue that, like, having the courage to start a podcast is something I've not done and something you've done, right? And it's like there's a lot to love about that. There's a lot to love about um, having a point of view that's contrarian because it's
Mm,
not popular.
mm.
You know, having the ability to embrace being a student of many disciplines.
Have you heard
You know,
about the
and
concept of the golden shadow?
it rings a bell, but I no, please enlighten me.
So, so the way that I got told the story of what your shadow is, and I think it was a beautiful story, is that you're born into this world, into a palace of a gazillion rooms, and then slowly as you grow up, your experiences through life and the kind of feedback that you get from parents, from friends at school, from school teachers, you end up closing door after door and shutting it down, so it becomes dark. So maybe you're too chaotic as a kid, and your parents tells you that you have to sit still or whatever. So you start closing the rooms, shutting them down. So the shadow is all of you that's not necessarily hidden, but it's not lit up either. And the concept of the golden shadow is perhaps somewhere along the way, your most beautiful gifts are the ones that you are most ashamed of. And I got introduced on another podcast just two weeks ago to the concept of people can have a tendency to end up in shadow careers. So say that your real
Mm,
passion is arts. For example, you want to be an actor. So you end up in a career that's kind of adjacent to that passion. So you're a creative director or you're
mm,
managing a movie set or something like that. And the idea of shadow work is to kind of uncover all of the rooms that you've closed down and allow yourself the permission to say that I actually want this. This is something that I find at the core of the essence. If I strip away, as your friend who ended up with cancer could do because of the
mm,
finality of life, all of the
mhm.
pretense, and I do this because of other people. If you consciously strip that away, then you can find perhaps like the gift that you're intended to give, right? And I've been thinking a
I
lot
love
about
that.
that, and especially in the concept now of moving countries and rearranging our lives,
Yeah.
and also in the context of what is the business that I'm trying to build. Like it's not intended to make the most amount of money. It's part of a much broader ecosystem that includes how can I be present as a husband, as a father. It includes how can I get to meet people that interests me a lot. So even like spending a bunch of time on a podcast is perhaps not, at least in the short term, the wisest business decision I've ever made. But it's a brilliant decision for my life.
When we first met, you said it's like it's your flex, right? It gets
Mm.
people that
Yeah, yeah,
that sit
exactly.
down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my podcast enables me to get access to people that I wouldn't normally have access to. That's for sure true.
Yeah. But I think inherent in that analysis is a thought error, I would argue, because why
Go
should you
ahead.
not have access to those people?
Yeah,
You
sure.
know,
Yeah.
you have the right to share great ideas, to
Mm.
bring your philosophy, which I have a lot of respect for, and your moral and ethical views into the minds of other leaders, right? And so, like, and this, you made a comment about ego, which I think is such an important part of this, right? Like, so many times in my life, I end up blaming ego or blaming my own ego or my lack of ego, and And I think ego is such a critical part of the self, obviously,
Mm.
that that optimizing the right parts of ego,
Yeah.
we shouldn't gaslight the ego question.
No,
We should
100%.
embrace ego as men, as fathers, and it's nothing to do with our gender either. But like, it happiness comes from having pride.
Mm.
Pride is an egotistical concept, but it's one that should be tethered in community, should be tethered
Mm.
in service, should be tethered in humility.
Mm.
And one of the phrases that came out of this entire Yara discussion, right, was this idea of the epistemic humility, this notion of
Okay.
taking a position, but being willing to accept that that position might be wrong. And there's a
Mm.
sort of an irony and a kind of a slight sort of sleight of hand almost to having a position, but also knowing that it could be wrong.
Mm.
And so I would argue, it's like, how do you live in that sort of, in that magical space between being opinionated and being humble,
Mm.
between being strong and being gentle,
Mm.
being able to enter the arena but know when to stop,
Mm.
and know when to pivot, or know when to meditate, to breathe, to rest. I think if
Mm.
and there's no right answer there, but what I do know is that value and the compound beauty of the world comes from, being very, very focused on not promoting reductivist harm, but also being
It's a good starting
unafraid.
point.
Yeah, being unafraid to bruise, And I
Mm.
think knowing that harmlessness is not the objective.
Mm.
Flourishing and being a forward-thinking, intellectually capable member of this civilization that we're continuing to perfect,
Yeah.
and with varying degrees of success. That's
Mm.
where we ultimately should be tethered.
You said that there are no good answers, but I would argue that there are clear bad answers to the question, right? And as far as I can see,
And there are
good
good
answer.
answers. There's no right answer. I think, right?
Yeah,
It's
fair.
one
Yeah,
of
good.
the concept of this law as a moral idea that Nigel
Mm.
Simmons promotes is that it's an archetype, and you never reach the top.
I'll make a commitment back to you. I'm heading into a really interesting period of going away on retreats again. I think values is going to be front and center for my reflections for the coming months, and I'm really thankful for that being one of the outcomes of this conversation.
I mean, I feel like this is the first of many. So let's keep
I'd love
talking,
to.
please.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
there's so much joy and so much kindness left in the world. We just need to really remember that that warriors, ideally, with good objectives,
Exactly.
are the way to unlock that for
Mm.
everybody, and to do so with grace and humility.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. This was beautiful.
Thank you very much.
And there, we're at the end of the episode. I think it's so amazing that almost 70% of you actually listen to the end of the episodes, especially for long format. I'm so thankful for that. Like, the engagement numbers is fantastic. Before we leave each other, two things. First off, this episode was sponsored by Grail, and I'll make no secret about it. Grail is the company that I'm starting. So it's the future of AI, and how can we unlock value that's not just automation, but actually building towards a future that we want to live in, like a future where I want to work, augmentation. So head over to grail.works to know more. Secondly, I'd appreciate so much that you listen to this podcast. But even though 70% listen to the end, almost 70% are not subscribed either. So if you can give a like button, subscribe to all my channels. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok apparently. We have an awesome webpage. And there's so much more content, like yes, the reels and so forth. But what I really would like to push for is that every week I publish a long format article which is the pinnacle of my thinking. So it's the most interesting thing that I come across that week, either in podcasts or in other endeavors. And I try to write about it towards you, a senior leader. Like, what is the crucial takeaway from the most important part of my week, let's say. I publish that on LinkedIn and on my webpage, thinkroompodcast.com. Thank you so much, and see you next time.